In 1914, the Endurance became a symbol of human resilience and survival. Built for Antarctic exploration, she entered history during Ernest Shackleton's expedition, proving that even in the harshest conditions, people can stand together without losing hope. Today, thanks to preserved photographs and the crew's accounts, we will step aboard her decks with the help of AI. We'll discover how it was built and why it became a legend of polar expeditions. Laid down in 1912 at the Framnes shipyard in Norway, Endurance was conceived during the Great Race to explore Antarctica. At a time when humanity sought to conquer the harshest environments on Earth, a ship was required that could withstand crushing ice pressure, protect her crew, and endure the forces of nature. Her construction took less than a year. When completed, she displaced about 350 tons, a sturdy yet relatively small vessel, specially reinforced for ice navigation. Her hull was built from thick oak timbers and heavy planking, designed to absorb and resist the pressure of the pack ice. This balance of strength, maneuverability, and reliability led Ernest Shackleton to select her for his expedition, an ambitious mission planned for 1914 to achieve the first crossing of Antarctica. Her length was 144 feet, and the beam was 25 feet. The ship's construction was uniquely suited to polar conditions. Her hull had rounded sides, allowing the vessel to rise onto the ice rather than be crushed, while thick oak frames provided additional strength, a critical feature for an Antarctic expedition. In addition, her relatively shallow draft allowed the ship to maneuver in shallow waters. Endurance had 3 masts with a full sailing rig, allowing good maneuverability in open waters. In addition to her sails, she was equipped with a coal-powered steam engine, providing extra power during periods of calm winds. Her maximum speed under steam was about 10 knots. This combination allowed the ship to cover long distances in icy conditions, where winds and pack ice could change unpredictably. Despite its modest size, the ship had a well-organized interior. The cabins were cramped, but thoughtfully arranged. Simple bunks or hanging hammocks filled the space, and personal belongings were kept in small chests or on narrow shelves. Officers and scientists had separate quarters, while the rest of the crew shared sleeping areas. Ernest Shackleton's cabin was located in the stern of the ship, the most prestigious area on board. The interior was simple and functional, a bed built into the ship's structure, a wooden writing desk, and a shelf holding maps and navigational instruments. It was here that the expedition journals, navigation records, and Shackleton's personal notes were kept, documents that would later become vital testimony to the events the crew endured. The entire crew gathered in the mess. It was a small wooden space with a long table at the center, benches along the walls, and only minimal light from kerosene lamps. It was here, over meals, that plans were discussed, decisions were made, and that fragile sense of unity was preserved, the very thing without which no expedition has any chance of success. Next to the mess was the galley, the ship's kitchen. At its center stood a coal-fired stove, heavy and cast iron, bolted securely to the deck. The cook, Charles Green, prepared meals for the entire crew under conditions that were far from comfortable. A cramped space, constant motion, and limited food supplies. A small scientific laboratory was set up on board, modest in size, but critical in purpose. Here, scientists examined samples of seawater, marine organisms, and atmospheric phenomena. Meteorologists recorded temperature, pressure, and wind direction, data invaluable to understanding the Antarctic climate. Even in the harshest conditions, this work never stopped, as the pursuit of the unknown was one of the expedition's central goals. Adjacent to the laboratory was the medical bay. In conditions of complete isolation, it was the only place where proper medical care could be provided. Surgical instruments, medicines, and bandaging materials were stored here, all carefully planned for a long expedition in extreme conditions. The ship's doctor, Alexander Macklin, together with his colleague James McElroy, carried round-the-clock responsibility for the health of all 27 crew members. Frostbite, injuries, and illness were treated here, but just as important was another role the doctors played, providing psychological support for men who lived for months in isolation and uncertainty. Near the engine room, photographer Frank Hurley converted a cold storage compartment into an improvised darkroom. Thick walls, complete darkness, and consistently low temperatures made it suitable for developing photographs. Cracks around the door were sealed with fabric, and the only light came from a dim red lamp. Here, in a cramped space filled with cold and damp, Hurley worked with fragile glass photographic plates. It was in this frozen darkness that the images were created, photographs that would later become the primary visual record of the expedition. In the hold of the Endurance was everything required for a long, self-sufficient expedition: tons of provisions, coal reserves, scientific equipment, medical supplies, and gear for working on the ice. All of it had been carefully calculated, packed, and stowed before the ship departed from London. On board the Endurance were 3 fully equipped lifeboats: James Caird, Stancomb Wills, and Dudley Docker. The boats were stored on deck, securely fastened, and maintained with particular care. Under normal circumstances, they served as auxiliary transport for landing ashore and maintaining contact with land. Endurance set sail with a crew of 27 men. They were not just sailors. Among them were scientists, a physician, a photographer, engineers, and experienced polar explorers. Each had been personally selected by Ernest Shackleton, who valued not only professional skill, but also character. He understood well that in complete isolation from civilization, the human factor mattered no less than the ship itself. Together, they had to become a single, coordinated organism, and it was precisely this unity that would later determine their fate. An integral part of the expedition was the 69 sled dogs, housed directly on deck. They had been selected specifically for work in extreme conditions. They were meant to pull sledges across the ice of Antarctica. Once the ship reached its destination, the dogs were a working force on which great hopes were placed. But during the long months of waiting, they became something more, a living reminder of warmth and simplicity amid the frozen emptiness. Crew members gave them names, cared for them, and grew genuinely attached to them. In a world where everything was subordinated to survival, the dogs remained simply dogs, and that was priceless. Endurance was built for one purpose: to conquer Antarctica. Every detail of her design, every inch of her oak hull, every knot of speed was devoted to a single goal. Ernest Shackleton and his crew were convinced that if any vessel could cut a path through the southern ice, it was theirs. But the true test of their endurance still lay ahead. In August 1914, Endurance departed from London, carrying the ambitions of an entire era. The first leg of the journey took her across the Atlantic Ocean to South Georgia, the last stop before the unknown. There, local whalers, who knew these waters better than anyone, offered a warning. The ice that year was unusually dense. Ernest Shackleton listened and pushed forward anyway. In December 1914, Endurance entered the Weddell Sea. At first, the ship made her way confidently through scattered floes, but the farther south she sailed, the denser the ice became. Captain Frank Worsley maneuvered with remarkable precision, searching for narrow leads between the pressure ridges. Yet by mid-January 1915, with only 150 kilometers remaining to the coast of Antarctica, the ice closed around the hull, quietly, almost imperceptibly, and Endurance came to a stop. At first, no one saw it as a disaster. The crew expected the ice to break apart within a few days, but days turned into weeks, and weeks into months. The floes drifted north with the ship, ever farther from their goal, and Endurance became a prisoner of an invisible force. In the middle of an endless frozen wilderness, the ship became their only home. For nearly 10 months, the crew lived aboard Endurance, held fast in the pack ice. To survive in these brutal conditions, they had to adapt to whatever Antarctica could provide. Seal and penguin meat, hunted directly on the ice, became the foundation of their diet. Fresh water came from melting snow and ice. To maintain physical strength and, more importantly, morale, Ernest Shackleton imposed a strict daily routine: watches, sports competitions on the ice, improvised concerts, and theatrical performances. He understood that people need more than food. They need purpose, laughter, and the reassurance that reliable companions stand beside them. But winter was approaching relentlessly. In May 1915, the polar night descended over the Weddell Sea. For 2 months, the crew lived in near-total darkness, with temperatures dropping below -40 degrees. The wind cut through everything. At night, the ice groaned and cracked, and the ship shuddered under the pressure of the frozen masses. When the sun finally returned in spring, the warming brought increased ice movement, and the pressure on Endurance's hull rose sharply. Her sides began to warp, and water poured in faster than it could be pumped out. Shackleton ordered the most essential supplies moved onto the ice: the lifeboats, provisions, navigation instruments, and warm clothing. He was preparing for the worst. On November 21st, 1915, Endurance slipped beneath the surface of the Weddell Sea. Shackleton watched in silence, standing on the ice. Then he turned back to his men. Now there was only one task left: to save every life. After losing their ship, 27 men found themselves stranded on a drifting ice floe in one of the most dangerous oceans on Earth. They set up camp directly on the ice, using the tents and tarpaulins they had managed to salvage. The 3 lifeboats became their only hope of survival, so they were mounted on makeshift runners and protected from even the slightest damage. For months they drifted northwest, completely at the mercy of the ocean currents. Their rations shrank with each passing day. The supplies saved from the ship were disappearing before their eyes. The men hunted seals, pitched and repitched their camp, and struggled to stay warm inside sleeping bags that were constantly damp and freezing stiff. The floe beneath them cracked and splintered, sometimes forcing them to move the entire camp in urgent haste to safer ground. Shackleton barely slept, constantly checking on his men, inspecting the ice, and assigning tasks. On April 9th, 1916, the floe finally broke apart. It was time to launch the boats. 3 small lifeboats pushed out into a storm-tossed sea, weaving between icebergs and floating slabs of pack ice. They were overloaded with men and supplies, riding dangerously low in the water as waves constantly broke over the sides. The men bailed without pause, rode to exhaustion, and felt their clothes freeze into stiff, icy shells around their bodies. At night, the temperature dropped so low that their sleeping bags turned hard as stone. Some lost all feeling in their fingers. Others collapsed unconscious from sheer fatigue. For 7 days and nights, they fought the ocean. Ernest Shackleton led them toward the nearest land, Elephant Island, a tiny fragment of rock and ice in the vast Southern Ocean. On April 15th, 1916, the boats finally reached its rocky shore. For the first time in 497 days, the men stood on solid ground. Some fell to their knees and kissed the stones. It was their first victory, but not yet their rescue. Elephant Island was uninhabited and far from any shipping routes. No one would come looking for them there. So Ernest Shackleton made a decision that bordered on madness. In a single lifeboat, the James Caird, he and 5 crewmen would attempt to cross 1,300 kilometers of storm-lashed ocean to South Georgia, where a whaling station offered their only hope of rescue. For 17 days, they battled violent seas, where waves towered as high as a 3-story building. Water constantly poured into the boat, their clothes never dried, and frostbite gnawed at their skin. Captain Frank Worsley, using only a sextant and chronometer, seized rare moments when the clouds parted to determine their position. One mistake, and they would miss the island entirely, lost in the ocean forever. On May 10th, 1916, through the fog, the outline of South Georgia finally appeared. They had made it, but landing on the southern coast was impossible in the storm. Forced to round the island, they came ashore on its uninhabited western side. The whaling station lay on the opposite coast, beyond a mountain range no one had ever crossed. Leaving 3 exhausted companions on the shore, Shackleton, Worsley, and Tom Crean set out across the mountains. For 36 hours they marched without rest, without climbing gear, guided only by instinct. On May 20th, 1916, 3 torn, starving men walked into the Stromness whaling station. The workers did not recognize them. They thought they were ghosts. But Shackleton was alive, and now he could finish what he had promised. Organizing a rescue proved far more difficult than anyone had expected. The first attempt, in June, failed. The ice around Elephant Island was too dense. A second attempt in July met the same fate. But Ernest Shackleton refused to give up. He moved from port to port, persuading, insisting, searching for a vessel capable of reaching his men. Finally, the Chilean government provided a small tug, the Yelcho. On August 30th, 1916, the Yelcho approached Elephant Island. Shackleton stood at the bow, scanning the shoreline. 22 men, the ones he had left behind 128 days earlier, came down to the beach. He counted them quickly, all of them, all 22, not a single loss. When he stepped ashore, Frank Wilde walked up to him and said calmly, "We knew you would come back." They had always known. All 27 members of the Endurance crew survived. For more than a century, Endurance lay on the seabed of the Weddell Sea, hidden beneath nearly 3 kilometers of icy water. In March 2022, an international research expedition located her using underwater drones. The ship was found in remarkably good condition. The name on the stern was clearly legible, and the wooden structures were preserved as if time had stopped on that November day in 1915. The discovery made headlines around the world, as Endurance had long been considered one of the most sought-after underwater treasures in history. Even beneath the ocean, she remained a symbol of human endurance and resilience. The story of Endurance is just one of hundreds of incredible maritime epics where human determination collided with the forces of nature. So let us know in the comments which story you'd like to hear next. Perhaps you're interested in the Mary Celeste, the ghost ship discovered drifting empty in the middle of the ocean? Or maybe you'd like to learn about the Bounty and the most famous mutiny in the history of seafaring? Or perhaps Erebus and Terror, the 2 ships of Franklin's expedition that vanished without a trace in the Arctic? Thank you for watching. See you in the next story.